All right, so in this lecture, we're going to go over all of the brush settings. In the next one, we'll go over specifically how to make your own brush. But for now, in this one, we're just going to look at each of the settings on a brush and talk about what they do, okay? This is going to be more or less the same for Photoshop and other software. There are going to be some differences. The basis for the Photoshop brush engine is different than Procreate, but a lot of these things are going to do the same no matter what program you're in if they have these as an option. So in Procreate, I'm going to take the default round brush that comes with the software, and I'm just going to duplicate it so that we don't accidentally mess up the original one. And I'm going to click on it, and it's going to take me into its brush properties, okay? So you see down here at the bottom, we have these different menus, okay? We're going to start with the first one and just go a stroke, okay? You can see here, it shows a preview of what the brush stroke looks like, and then we can use these sliders to change things, okay? So stroke properties, right? Each stroke is comprised of a single shape repeated multiple times. Spacing slider is going to tell us how far apart each of those shapes are. If we have them really high, they're going to be spaced as far apart as possible. If we do them really close, it's going to be really smooth because there's lots of those shapes being placed very close to each other. If you want something more textured and rough, you'll probably want the spacing to be a little bit higher, okay? Streamline is going to be how much the stroke is streamlined when you draw. So for example, if the streamline is all the way off, it's going to pick up every little nuisance and little line that you make and variation in your stroke. If you have the streamline high, it's going to smooth the line so that's not as rough. I'll give you an example. So if we come over here and we draw with this, okay, this is what it looks like when it's not streamlined, and we'll make the brush smaller so you can see it even clearer, okay? That's not streamlined. Now if we bring the streamlined all the way up, you can see it smooths everything out. It's really hard for me to get really jagged lines unless I go really slow and get really small, okay? Same when it gets bigger even, it smooths it all out, okay? That's what streamline does. So we'll turn that back off. Jitter, I'm going to turn up spacing a little bit so we can see jitter some more. Jitter is going to be the random variations in the angles of that shape. So right now, they're all stacked right on top of each other, facing the exact same way in the same orientation. When we adjust jitter, it's going to turn some of those and mess up the spacing a little bit so they're not all in the same spot, okay? Which will give us a little bit more. If I bring the spacing back down, it's definitely going to give us more of a textured brush, okay? The more jitter we have. So you can see when I paint with it now, it has a lot more texture to the edges than we did before, okay? Fall off is going to be when you're drawing and you let go, it has a little bit of a fall off, okay, the more you draw. So you can see like as I continue to go, it gets softer and softer and softer. Fall off is adjusting that. If you do it really high, it will barely draw anything, and if you do it really low, it won't have a fall off at all. You can keep drawing indefinitely. This is good for if you're wanting to do something like maybe a pencil brush that slowly gets duller as you draw with it and isn't as dark. You could do that. Stroke taper is going to be how much it tapers at the beginning and end. So we're going to bring these back down so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And if we adjust the taper here, if we can even hit it, there we go. Okay, on this, it doesn't look like it does much, but it's adjusting the end when the brush stops drawing, which you might not be able to see unless you adjust some of the other settings. So we'll taper it and then adjust, here we go. So if we adjust end and opacity and things like that, it will make a difference. You can see size, for example, on the brush preview. The more we put size up, the more of a taper it has. And opacity and the other ones aren't showing up a lot on this brush, but it will depend on what kind of brush you're using. It does go with start and end. You can see a difference, okay? Let's go on to shape. Shape behavior, scatter, which is going to kind of randomize it similar to jitter. And rotation, you can adjust the rotation of all of them. So let's say they are all facing the same way, but you want the direction they're facing to face a different way. Here, I'll go back to this so you can see. We'll space it out really far and go up here to rotation. All it does is change the rotation of all of them so they're all facing the same way, but you can choose which way they're facing. And then scatter is just going to randomize it, okay? Shape properties, you can randomize it so it's just completely different. And this azimuth does almost the same thing, okay? We'll move on to grain. Grain behavior, this is stuff you're usually not going to mess with. It only matters on a very small amount of brushes. This one doesn't have a lot of grain anyways, so it doesn't really matter, but it's basically saying when you're drawing, does it follow the movement of your brush or does it just stay static? Scale is how big your grain is going to show up in the actual brush size. I'm pretty sure this one just has a flat basic white for the grain, so there's not really going to be anything showing up on this one. But when we make a brush, we will be using these settings. You can see it more. Rotation is the same thing. Filtered, it's not going to do much because we don't really have a grain with this one. Dynamics, so this one you can change how the brush interacts with the other paint. Normal is just going to allow it to be a normal brush, okay? It just paints right onto the surface of things. And we did something, let's go ahead and fix that. Let's put these back how they were before so that we can see and adjust. Okay, let's try it now, there we go. Okay, so fall off, or sorry, normal. Normal is just going to paint normal, okay? Glaze is going to paint like, imagine kind of how it would if you were using like a glaze brush, right? You can kind of see it over the top of things unless you push really dark, okay? And wet mix is going to make it interact with the other paint around it. You can see how it starts to blend with the other paint instead of just sort of going on top of it. It mixes it together when it starts to lighten up, okay? Dilution, each one of these is going to have its own settings. We're not going to go super detailed into all of these because there's a lot of them, but these are ones that you can just mess with to find the ones you want, okay? Pencil, these ones are important. So this one says Apple pencil pressure. So it's saying the lighter you push, the less opaque it's going to be. But we can do the opposite where if you push hard, like right now I'm drawing really light, and then when I lift my pencil up, it starts to get a lot thinner, okay? Or sorry, when I push down, it starts to get thinner. When I draw light, it's thick. When I start to push down is when it gets thin, okay? So depending on how you set this, it'll have a little bit more of a fall off or less. Typically you want it like this most of the time, okay? Bleed is exactly what it sounds like. How far does it bleed out based off of how hard you're pushing, okay? Size, once again, if you want it to get really big, the harder you push, you would put this all the way max. If you want to get smaller, the harder you push, then you put it all the way to the other side. Or if you don't want the size to change at all, then just leave it in the middle, okay? Then softness, this is going to be how soft you want the end of the brush to be, right? So maybe you want it hard and crisp in the middle, but as you paint or draw, you want to soften up when you bring up the pressure a little bit, okay? Just remember this, all of these that say Apple pencil pressure, the right side of the slider means pushing harder, and the left side of the slider is when you push softer, okay? That's how you can remember that. And then Apple pencil tilt, okay? So on the iPad, when you're doing this, if you hold your brush at an angle, it has a little bit of a different effect, okay? So if you hold, and you could choose an angle too, how far they have to be for it to kick in. That's what this first slider is, okay? Then you can choose the gradation or the bleed, size, stuff like that. So let's say when I hold it sideways, I want it to get really a lot bigger because it's being sideways and it would cover up more surface, right? So I can bring that up and it should do a whole lot more, okay? You can see, has a little bit of a different effect, and you can turn the size compression on and off as well. Then we go over to general. All right, we have the brush name, you could change that. Stamp preview, so it shows what the single point of that brush looks like instead of the full, I guess what you would call the stroke, right? I like it as a stroke preview instead of the stamp preview. And then you can choose how big the preview size is as well with this slider beneath it. Okay, brush behavior, orient to screen. That means that when you turn your canvas sideways, the brush will orient with it as well if it has a specific directional quality to it. Blend mode set to normal. You can change the actual blend mode of the brush, similar to how you change the layer modes. However, that can get pretty complicated. I recommend staying away from that unless you're pretty advanced. Most of the time you can get what you need just by creating a new layer and setting it to that blend mode. Smudge, it's smudginess when you're working with like the smudge tool. Size limits, what's the max size it can get versus the smallest it can get. The farther apart you put these, the bigger the dynamic range is going to be, right? So if you don't want it to get crazy big when you push really hard, then you're going to want to move these two sliders a little bit closer to each other so that it doesn't do that when you're drawing, okay? And then the last menu is the shape source. So you can see I was correct, the grain source is just straight white, but if we were to put in a different grain source, like say the texture of paper, then it would have a little bit of a paper texture when we were drawing, okay? And the shape source is what that original stamp is, okay? So that's everything you need to know. You can click this invert shape stuff and it'll do the opposite, right? So now the shape is the white part instead of that black part. You can put in your own shape source, insert a photo, whatever you want to do. Just make sure that the shape source, you want the shape to be white and everything else to be black, because anything that's black is going to show up as a transparency for the shape source, okay? All right, well, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you guys in the next one.